Okay, I think I know we're getting started a little bit late, but I think we really should get started so we're not over time. So I would encourage folks to please go ahead and take a seat. If you have a name tent, please grab it from the front, and also the sign-in sheets are right there next to the name tents. Okay, great. Thank you so much. Just want to welcome everyone to the AB 617 Technical Advisory Group meeting. This is the third meeting of the Technical Advisory Group. Just to note that we are live on the webcast, and there are some folks who are viewing on the webcast. Did get an email from Ken Davidson, who noted that he was participating by webcast today. So again, my name is Jo K. Gosh. I'm just going to go over some really quick housekeeping announcements. If you're looking for the restrooms, they are through this back door and to the left. In the case of an emergency, we may have to duck and cover, shelter in place, or it may have to exit the room, exit the building. So we've got exits on both sides, the front and the back of the room, and another door will lead you out to the courtyards. And I think with that, we're going to go ahead and get started. We have really one main topic on the agenda today, and that is, of course, to talk about the source attribution analysis that we've been doing as part of AB 617. The members on the advisory group received the email with both the methodology document as well as the community-specific reports, so one report for each community, so a total of 4 documents, and all of those are now posted on the website for anyone who would like to view them. I do want to note that these are all in draft form, and it's meant as basically a basis for having this discussion and getting this feedback. And of course, there are opportunities to make adjustments and changes as time goes on. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Sang-Mi Lee.
Do we want an introduction around table, or we just start?
Yeah. Let's actually start with a quick introduction just around the table. So kind of starting at the top here.
Eric Brasky, AQMD.
This is Mark Carreras from AQMD as well.
Sang-Mi Lee, AQMD.
Jo K. Gosh, AQMD.
Andrea Polidori, AQMD.
Sunny Ivy, University of California, Riverside.
Jesse Marquez, Coalition for Safe Environment in Wilmington.
Scott Fruin, USC.
Tammy Yamasaki, San Bernardino Steering Committee member and Southern California Edison.
Janet Whittick, California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance, and I'm also on the ARB AB 617 consultation group.
Good morning, Rafael Yanez, resident Boyle Heights in East LA, as well as on the LA San EJ team.
That's it? Great. Okay, thanks for coming. So today, what we talk is the criteria and then toxic air pollutants emissions inventory for base and future milestone years. So last time when we had a meeting, roughly 2 months ago, in the end of May, we talked about mostly the methodology itself. So the very first time when we started CSC and then the AB 617 clean community discussions, we were relying on the existing database and then the result heavily. But then based on the ARB's guidance document, it came out, and beginning of April, we were revising all the emissions inventory to comply with the guideline requirement. That is basically the newer base years and then adding future milestone years. So last working group meeting, we talked about the methodology, how to get there, how to comply with this new requirement coming from the ARB's guidance. But then again, the one step back, so the reason we are doing source attribution is to assist the effort of communities' communities' emission reduction program. So this ARB's guidance document, as well as the Clean Air Communities Blueprint, talk about what source attribution is. So source attribution is defined as rigorous accounting of sources and emissions, and then contribution to cumulative exposure burdens. So the reason we are doing this, as I explained briefly, eventually to assist the community emission reduction effort. And then this is by statutory definition, it is provide a methodology for assessing and identifying the contributing sources and categories of sources, including stationary and mobile sources, and then estimate their relative contribution to the exposure. To do so, there are 5 different methodologies that identified in the guidance document. So those are, first one is community emissions inventory methodology, and the second one, community specific air quality modeling, and the third one is targeted air monitoring and back trajectory, pollution woes, and inverse modeling. And the fourth one is chemical mass balance, and then the last one is positive metrics factorization method. So inventory methodology, pretty much intuitively what you would guess, that is basically you estimate the emissions from all different categories and sectors, and then the estimate how that will change with the time to future year. So air quality modeling, once you have emissions inventory ready, and then you come up with the meteorological condition, you put in this computerized box that calculates chemical reactions and transport, and then come up with the receptor point concentration. So third one, targeted monitoring, back trajectory or inverse monitoring is primarily relying on the measurement data. So let's say you identify the hotspot, either through measurement or your long-term experience of knowing the area. If you know the area, then you can start from that point and going backwards to identify the sources that contribute to it. And then the fourth one is chemical mass balance means, so let's say again, you have a location that you suspect or you're concerned that might have a high exposure or a high concentration. Then you, through this chemical data or chemical speciated data, you identify the sources of it. Where would that coming from? And then the last one is fairly similar, and then it's relying on the long-term, the relatively long-term, and then very detailed chemical speciation data to do similar type of analysis of identifying the sources of it. So out of these 5 approaches, what we have developed so far for the first year is mostly community emission inventory approaches. So, but then the second, we kind of checked mark on this air quality modeling. We did not do specific modeling for the year 1 community. However, we have this, the previous studies that provides modeling results. So in a way that touch based on. Targeted monitoring will be available for the years to come, since we have this air monitoring plan in place. And then once we identify through the monitoring or with the discussion with the community members, so once the hotspots or need is identified, we can deploy that methodology. Chemical mass balance approach requires a reliable input data. Here, reliable input means, let's say trains or cargo handling equipment, and then you need to know what type of chemical species coming out of the specific process of engine types, fuel types, and the locations information. So that type of information is often outdated and old, and then not developed for the specific communities, not even for the specific air basin. So there are challenges in applying that methodology. The last one, the PMF approach, is a possibility since we have collected over a year-long data through MATES 5 program, and then that might be something that we can try on. However, this also requires quite extensive chemical speciation data. So in conclusion, for the year one community, we heavily relied on emissions inventory methodology. And then this specific presentation is touch base on this emissions methodology and then the result of it. So this one was touch based on the last meeting as well. So the air pollutants that are required to be addressed in AB 617 Clean Air Community Programs are in two categories: criteria air pollutants, we all know of it, and then another one is toxic air contaminants. Toxic air contaminants kind of easy to label it, but it's kind of a little challenging because in reality there can be hundreds of them. And then some of them, actually many of them, are real small volume available in the atmosphere. So it is difficult to detect and difficult to track even the emissions or concentration of it. So for this report, we use 24 species. Those are called the basic toxic air contaminant species. Those are primary tags included in this analysis. However, I'd like a note that we have AB 2588 toxic hotspot program. So if there is any facility that is above the threshold, then they are required to go through very rigorous analysis through AB 2588. So assessing the health risk assessment of over 400 species. And then if it's still somehow above threshold, then they have to come up mitigation. So if any of those information would be your interest, we can provide the latest report and a link as well. So what this is source attribution analysis, this is example of tags, a tag, TAC, since as mentioned, there can be hundreds of them, and then these are just selected example. For example, pretty often you would hear diesel particle matter, that is particles emitted from diesel-fueled internal combustion engines, and then benzene, 1,3-butadiene, and hexavalent chromium, etc. Those are, you will see later on in the presentation, that are identified as one of more pronounced tag species. And each tag species has something called cancer risk associated with it. But this is again air toxics cancer risk. So the idea is if a resident or human has a chronic exposure to a certain level of the concentrations, then this amount of risk can be present. And then, as you can see in the second column, cancer risk are all over. It is very different from one pollutant to another pollutant, meaning that not all the toxics are kind of weighed equal or created equal. So kind of cancer potency associated with them are different. So the way we presented or the way we conducted our analysis is we tried to put all these species in a same page so we can compare them in a more consistent way. So for example, diesel PM is 7.44 e to the minus 4th, and then hexavalent chromium is 3.45 e to the minus 1. So it is like 500 times higher cancer potency in hexavalent chromium. However, in the atmosphere, there are a lot higher volume of DPM than hexavalent chromium. So how can we compare then these two species together? For that, we came up with this so-called relative factors to DPM. So if we set DPM as 1, the rest of the species, you can basically ratio it. And then that's the last column is. And then last comment I'd like to add on this slide is this cancer, the risk factors are based on OEHA's the latest cancer risk tables, but then the inhalation factors and then exposure rate are considered and updated to these factors, and then those approaches are well defined in our MATES 4 study. So now we are going into the inventory details. So we have talked about that there are 4 distinctive categories in emissions inventory. Those are point, area, on-road, and off-road mobile sources. And depending on source categories, the approach the approach to estimate emissions are vastly different. So for example, we discussed these approaches in the previous 2 meetings, so I will just screen through very quickly since I presume nobody wanna hear the same discussions 3 times. So for example, the point source, this is based on reported emissions. So we have this program called the Annual Emissions Reporting Program. So any facilities that emits above the threshold amount that has to report their emissions to us every year. And then that consists of the point source emissions. But those facilities, we just to simplify, we call it AER facility, reports both criteria pollutants as well as air toxics. And then that's a base year emission. And then future year emissions, again, required, as mentioned, that by the ARB's guidance document. So future year emissions, we have to apply how much the sources would grow in the future and then how much the regulations would affect. Growth basically act to increase the amount of emissions, but on the other hand, regulation should decrease the amount of emissions. So those two basically cancel out each other, but then what we are hoping for is the regulation in many cases overcome the growth, so eventually emissions goes down. But then you will see some sources growth is faster than regulations, so then you would see some minor or some increases in the future. Secondly, so on-road mobile emissions have very different approaches. Those are all the cars on the street. So somebody needs to know how many cars out there, how many miles they drive, and then how old each cars are, what the fuels they use. And then those information is coming from SCAG, the Southern California Association of Government. And then emission factors, we all know old cars are dirtier typically than cleaner cars. So those emission factors and information is required, and that information is coming on mobile source emission model, MFAC. So ARB is responsible for the maintaining and updating this MFAC model, and then we use the latest available MFAC model, that is MFAC 2017. Future year emission is again challenging part, but then SCAG as a metropolitan planning organization have a blueprint how the future traffic patterns or transportation patterns would be, and then where the new highways will be, and then where the expansions will be, because they are part of the planning. So they come up with this blueprint how future will be, and then we utilize their information. And then MFAC, again, the reflecting the growth, meaning that the more and more cars on the street, and then the regulations. So regulation always kind of moving toward a stringent direction to have less emissions. So we incorporate those factors through MFAC. Off-road mobile source is also fairly challenging part, but then off-road emissions, there are many different categories: aircrafts, trains, ocean-going vessels, lawn and garden equipment, and construction equipment, forklifters, so many different things. But then some of them, the populations and activities and the model years, etc., reported to ARB's database. It's called DOORS, and then and some of them, when such specific information is not available, then it's depending on some survey data. So those are category specific. And then the emission factors also, ARB has off-road model that provides the emission, some of them coming from other sources such as the federal government, but that off-road model, for example, provides the kind of aggregated emission rate for different types of equipment, different model year of equipment, and then different calendar year aggregated emissions. So that is the basis to develop off-road mobile source emission. Area source is something that it's let's say very small car washing place or auto body shop, really small mom and pop place located at the corner of the street. Then that kind of information is not treated as explicitly point source because there are 100,000 of them in the basin. So then you basically put or aggregate similar type of businesses together and then come up with some high level either consumption data or sales data or similar activity data. And then you start from county level or state level and then trying to estimate the total emissions and try to distribute at a specific location or specific community. And then to come up with the future emissions, you go through very similar to point source, and the growth and controls by regulations needs to be considered. So I talked about base and the future years, and then these are kind of schematics of the different years or different timelines we have to work with. So 2017 was selected as a base year case. So all the 2017 base year emissions are developed based on actual activity data, reported data, or some consumption data or sales data, whichever is available for the category. And then from there, we projected it to the future year. As you can see, those two milestone future years are 2024 and 2029, supposedly 5-year, 10-year from the designation of the community. And then this is a simple, very simple equation how the emission forecasting has to be. We had more in-depth discussion in the last TAC meeting. So base year emission basically E_BY, subscript BY, that multiply by growth factor that's typically coming from the SCAG, and then multiply by control factor that comes from regulations. That becomes future year emission. And then this equation becomes a little bit blurry when it comes, for example, mobile sources, because MFAC 2017, this mobile source model somehow implicitly combine growth and control together. And then there is also limitations. So in the future fleet, for example, let's think about the light passenger vehicle. So there are more cars in the future years. That's basically growth of the population. And then another one, let's say when you are getting new cars because it's time to get a new car, and then you would go newer vehicle that's available at the market at the time of purchase, then but that's basically turning over to the newer vehicle. Whether it would reflect current regulation at the time, because, for example, 1970 standard dirty heavy VOC emitting cars was not available at the time. But that kind of turning over is a kind of natural turnover. But at the same time, because of regulations, the newer cars has to be on the market. So that kind of growth and controls are kind of blended together in the mobile source categories. So that factors, but anyway, coming from mobile source model, MFAC model. But this is the basics of the projecting future year emissions. And then these are our selected examples of regulations. We talked about the regulations for criteria pollutants, for example, NOx regulations last time. So these are, for example, the toxic emission, the regulation the South Coast AQMD had adopted till last year. Since this community program, there is emphasis on the air toxics, so we brought this example of this. And then there are so-called 1420 series. Those are targeting lead emissions. And then also 1469, that is targeting to reduce hexavalent chromium. And 1421 is banning the perc emissions from dry cleaning the businesses, and then solvent degreaser, the controlling solvent degreaser, that's 1122. And then this table showing the regulations that ARB adopted relatively recently. For example, the zero emission airport shuttle program was adopted just last month, just a few weeks old, brand new regulations here. And then these are, MFAC supposedly reflect all the newer regulations, but these regulations came after the release of MFAC. However, ARB, and then we wanted to incorporate this impact of the newer regulations in the emissions inventory. Specifically, some of the regulation has really huge impact on the diesel PM. And then these are the specific rule factors. And actually, one disclaimer here is the factor for innovative clean transits for buses. So the correction control factors for 2029 supposedly 0.864. So we will make the correction and then update on the website. But the overall emission impact is very small, but so just a disclaimer, one number has to be replaced here. I think we can just.
I think we can go ahead and take,
Yeah,
take a
just
question if,
let's
you're,
go ahead.
if it's specific to this section.
Oh, then you can. Oh.
Why don't we do this? I think so. So I feel like there is a natural break.
At this point,
Like right around this time. So basically, if you're done presenting this slide, then I think this is kind of like one natural break. I'd prefer not to have questions kind of chop up, the whole presentation. But I guess I realize it's a pretty long presentation as well, and we're going to go through a ton of data in the next section. So maybe this is the point to break and have some questions, and then we can go through the data, and then more questions at the end. Does that sound reasonable? Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe I'll just jump in. So this is Janet Whittick from Steve, and I appreciate that as you were discussing the last two slides, you were saying that these were examples of the rules that are going into place and that have been included in terms of the inventory development. I think maybe if you could say that it's just a partial list on the slides, because for the toxics, 1402 is missing, and that's the 2588 program. Honestly, I know you don't have all of the plans in and all of the facility inventories in at this point, but that's going to be as significant, if not more so, than everything listed here. And then we'll also have the ARB updates to the ATCMs coming. So in future years, the projections, there's a whole bunch of rulemaking that's happening in the near future that's going to influence what we see in these communities. Likewise, on the control factors for the diesel vehicles, like the truck and bus rule isn't listed. And then we all know we have the advanced clean trucks coming forward, and we all expect to see a heavy duty inspection and maintenance program and other major things happening in the next year or so. So is it the intention, if and when those get approval, either here or at ARB, that those will then be included in future year projections and everything updated?
Thanks for the question. So it is a sort of example of the rules that reflected on the emission, but then the emission inventory, in a sense, we are always saying it is like moving target or evolving organism, because as you mentioned, there are regulations, that there are upcoming regulations, it is constantly changing. So that's why we put the version number on emissions inventory, so to indicate until what point the regulations are reflected on. So we are sharing this emissions inventory with the community members and tech members at the point. So we included the regulation that has adopted. I would say it's more fairly, I would say, as of last year. For example, this tag emissions, that's adopted as of last year. But then it's anything more significant, we can take a look and then we can update quickly. But then still, this is not the end of the game, so we will be continuously developing it. As you would well know, the next AQMP is just around the corner. In that case, we will update entire emissions inventory. and also the truck and bus regulation has a high impact on the diesel PMs, but then they are reflected in the emissions inventory as well. The reason we pick up these regulations are these are specific as a post-MFAC 2017 release. Yeah. So everything that's reflected in MFAC 2017 are already incorporated. Thank you. Raphael? Oh, Jesse? Oh,
Thank you. So So I'm just trying to understand, again, the emissions, the issues with, let me start over. So the community inventory, the emission inventory that's going to be utilized in this particular model versus the targeted. So some of the potential problems that I see with that is that it may be incomplete, and so when we start moving towards a more targeted model, the numbers are going to be greatly skewed. I think. Could be wrong, but you know, that's one of my opinions, because I think as we start to discover more and more, and then we start targeting those specific areas and stuff, we're going to start catching a lot of companies and whatnot that aren't previously included in the reporting model. And so that was with the other thing, getting to like the AERs and relying on the AERs. There's a lot of inaccuracies in terms of the self calculations that a lot of the companies and stuff do. I know staff has provided a lot of resources to help those companies in their reporting efforts. But I think the problem is some of the companies could be relying on old data, old monitoring information and stuff, and not reporting accurate or current or up to date type of analysis and whatnot that they've seen on their emissions, which could potentially be a problem. And so that brings about a couple of questions and raises a couple of concerns. One is, there could be new warehouses, different added growth and changes to commerce movements, and then trade decisions, as we've seen, now on the national level and stuff, and then the reprioritizing of, maybe getting goods into the country, and then there's a slowdown, and then all of a sudden there's a pickup again. And so it's that kind of stuff that really impacts the early communities that are AB 617 communities that are problematic. And then could be some zoning changes or even lack thereof. So we're seeing different facilities being utilized for different type of developments and whatnot. And then, so it begs the question in terms of like the number of inspectors and whatnot that we have out there, that AQMD has out there, or even ARB has out there, in order to encourage those and make sure that those companies currently in new operations are actually doing their necessary reporting. Because in some cases, not all, but in some cases, they may not know that they need to be reporting, or that they need an actually air quality emissions permit for the type of business they're doing. So one of the things that I think, especially for the communities that are in the first year program, what a possible suggestion would be to help allow the community to get more involved, so that, and involvement, I would mean perhaps the Air Quality Management District can produce a list of currently reporting companies in the area in each specific community. So that way the general public will actually have an opportunity to help police, if you will, if they don't see a particular company that is currently emitting within their community. If they're not on the list, then we can report back to staff and let you guys know, so that way more detailed investigation can be had, so to ensure that an emission permit has been issued for the company, and then 2, staff can go ahead and verify if emission reporting is necessary for that particular company or industry. Thank you.
So thank you for the question and comment, Rafael. So the first thing about kind of accuracy of emissions inventory, including those reported and then other goods movement or mobile sources. So as a scientist, I'd like to say emission is perfect, but we all know that is not the case. That's why we always acknowledge there is uncertainties. But then, as I mentioned, as we make the future versions, we try to reduce uncertainties as much as possible. So having said that, we had some level of success when we were doing this basin-wide effort, like AQMD type of effort. Even despite the uncertainties, we have shown the progress in air quality. We have shown the progress that has been even measured not only by us, by even satellite that confirms the progress. That indicates despite uncertainty, there have been some truth in it, in the approach what we are doing, but still that doesn't mean our approach is perfect. For example, you're talking about the reporting nature. The nature of the reporting emissions, there could be some concerns, but then that's when this collaboration or combining different approaches such as the monitoring. The monitoring we're talking about not just traditional fixed site monitoring. There is mobile platform that try to catching this fugitive emissions, and then there are sensors. And it covers in a resolution that has never seen before, and then there would be the satellite data already available in the very fine resolution. So they all are in a sense, big brother eye everywhere. Hopefully we can catch unaccounted emissions that are unaccounted for. And then second, also your suggestion of letting community members know the locations of the reported facilities. So in the previous presentation, we had a map showing the many different dots located within the community. That is actually the location of facilities that currently reporting through our AER system. Also in our website, it's called a tool called Find, F-I-N-D. You put the zip code and city name, etc. Then you can pull out the facility emission information. ARB maintains similar type of the searching tool on their own website as well. But those information is all public. We can share those locations and make it very clear that the community members and the tech members can have the monitors or keep an eyes on them. And any permitted source information you can also find through our Find software. So we will make clear that those tours, the location of those tours and availability of those tours to the members.
So I think with Find, right now there's current, as was addressed at the last meeting, there are certain limitations for Find. And so while we're waiting for the next available version of it, I think it would be helpful if a printout or at least an Excel table can be pulled out from the database, so that for the specific communities, like I was asking, they could actually be listed, at least just the name and the address of the companies that are actually currently have a report, a current report, because many times a company, for instance, if you go in to Find, sometimes if you look at a particular company, you find that the last report that they issued was back in 2008 or maybe 2011 or something like that. And so that's not a real accurate representation of whether or not a company has been reporting or not. So if, let's say, for instance, if they're not on the list, then hopefully the search could be filtered out where it's only listing companies that have reported within the last, let's say, 5 years would be helpful.
Okay.
Yeah, so certainly, we can kind of pull the data and just trying to figure out what would be most useful. So we can definitely kind of talk offline about that. I think one of the things that you were kind of alluding to was the new ARB regulation that expands the number of facilities and also the types of facilities that would be reporting. Of course, that doesn't kick in until I believe next year. I think it's year 2020 emissions reported in 2021, I believe is the case. So, obviously there will be more data associated with that. And I think it's a really, astute point that you make that, there needs to be training, especially because we do know that a lot of these facilities that will be newly reporting are small facilities that, don't have dedicated staff just to do emissions reporting. And so kind of along with the rollout of that regulation is going to be some facility training and then, to help those facilities, do accurate reporting because, just having more data is not necessarily better. Having quality data is certainly what we're all aiming for. And I think, as far as, having the community identify facilities, either a facility that's having an issue or a facility that they see when they're there in person, but they're not finding in the database. Obviously, this is something that we would definitely want to know about. One of the actions that we wrote into the East LA plan is actually a permit cross-check with the land use agencies. I think that's kind of like one level of verifying that, for example, a facility that has a conditional use permit with the land use agency, if they require an air permit, then they had better be in our database. Now there are obviously facilities that require a conditional use permit that do not require an air permit, so it's not going to be 100% match, of course, but there are facilities that we know require a permit, and so we can do it by type of facility, by category. But the limitation on that, of course, is that you're not capturing facilities that are completely unpermitted. And I think that is a far more difficult issue to catch. And so certainly if there are suggestions on how the community can help identify these completely unpermitted facilities, certainly we would be interested, and I'm sure the land use agencies would also be interested in knowing that these facilities exist too.
So again, I guess that's why I was suggesting the list. If you actually have a list that's easily to access, that very specific problem could be addressed. The problem with addressing the issues with the land use, permitting entities and bodies and whatnot, many of the cities in and around, for instance, the East LA Boyle Heights and surrounding communities, they're very small municipalities and very small staffed. So many times there's a staff of 3 people that are handling that particular type of issues, and then they're also multitasking. So to rely solely on them to do that type of cross-referencing, I think realistically it may not happen. And so that's another challenge. So again, if we can have lists for the community members available, at least it gives us an opportunity, and it doesn't have to be an extensive list with many tables and all that stuff and many columns or whatever. It could be a very simple list, just so that we can go ahead and say, oh, wait a minute, this is not right, something's not right. Then it allows us to go into Find and obtain the more detailed information.
Okay. Yeah, we can
you.
certainly provide a list. Yes. Jess.
Sorry, can I ask you, Rafael? You mentioned at the beginning an issue between targeted.
Can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. You mentioned in the beginning about an issue about targeted emissions inventory versus community. I don't know what you mean by that. Can you?
Well, we were just, because, they were talking about just utilizing inventory, current inventory emission data that you guys currently have versus targeted data. And I guess it's a future plan, from what I understand. going back to that slide with the check marks and whatnot. We're having technical issues.
So you mean you mean targeted? You mean future emissions by that? Okay, all right, okay, thanks.
Okay, so we move on. Jesse, you like to raise questions, or you wanna save it for the afterwards, or what would you
I'll have
like
more
to
by
do?
that time. Jesse Marquez, Coalition for a Safe Environment. Well, first I want to compliment the staff for doing a great job in putting this together. I realize there's a lot of detailed information, but that's the detailed information that we do need. Now, I found nothing wrong with it, so that's the good news.
Thank you.
But where you have to understand, some of us organizations, we are doing a lot of community-based science and research also. So if anything, there is additional information that we would like to have. Like, for example, we're asking for new interpretations of data so that, it's relevant to us. In the past years, you have to understand, some of us are using AQMD data. I use the fine every year on a regular basis. I've been tracking the six major oil refineries in LA for, since 2000. I know exactly what the emissions are for all criteria pollutants. And then we have our selected top 20 chemicals under the toxic pollutants. So, I'm an expert on that, okay? I can show it because I have it here right now. So I can't be fooled, I can't be lied to, because, this is your data and this is what we utilize to help interpret things, so that when we have to address public policies and rules and regulations, we can talk intelligently. Is it successful? Is it not successful? If you're quoting information that there's been all kinds of reductions, well, yes, if we're talking about in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But if you ask me, Jesse, what have you done for me lately? And I look at the last 10, 15 years, there's been no significant reductions. So we want to make sure that you understand that we're not dumb. There's a lot of us that are
never.
educated. We have a lot of young students that are graduating with masters and PhDs, so they're following our footsteps and being able to, help us and understand this data. But at the same time, you have to realize, what is reality? Reality is that we got elected officials and we got appointed officials. They're looking at this report and these documents. So if there's things left out, they don't know it's been left out. When they look at the report, they're going to say, this is a 100% great report. Okay? If I look at it, it's an 85% great report. Not that nothing's wrong, just that there's additional information we need. Now, what's an example of that? Source emissions, okay? We have already identified in AB 617 and 100 other times in other meetings that there are data gaps. All we're asking is that you acknowledge in the document there are data gaps, and here is what the community has brought up. At the Wilmington Committee, Coalition for Safe Environment has identified container storage yards in Wilmington. There are over 100 container storage yards in Wilmington. There is no inventory of the thousands of trucks every day going in and out of those things, or any of the cargo handling equipment that's operating, moving those things around these yards. So we're not saying AQMD didn't do a job. All we're saying is that now we're in a partnership where we've identified a category. There is no emissions data on it. So in your report, we want you to acknowledge community has identified this source, and this source, so that now you're able to say one of the goals for 2020 is now to begin doing that emissions inventory, so that, by 2022, or 2021, we'll have data. But see, we did a great job. We identified it. We know it can't be done today. We know it can't be done tomorrow, but it's on our radar screen, and the metrics are being, now applied to it. And then some things are not that complicated. Like, for example, we've been fortunate because Andrea's been meeting with us, every month at our office and discussing things. And one of the other categories is that we have 500 operating oil wells, another 300 to 500 abandoned oil wells. What are the emissions from those? Now you start to think, wow, it's going to take a staff, 1,000 hours. We might have to get consultants. Well, there's again where we partner, where we apply the KISS principle.
Mhm.
All we need is somebody like our Coalition for Safe Environment who has trained people on how to use a TSI Q-Track. It's a $10,000 instrument that measures VOCs. All we need to do is show up at one site, turn it on for 5 minutes, nothing. Move to the next site, turn it on 5 minutes, nothing. And then all of a sudden, site number 17, blunk. Okay, write that down. AQMD then comes down and follows it up with a big expensive piece of equipment to determine what it is. But again, that's another identified source. We set a goal for it, and boom, it's done. But please,
So-
recognize that this is a request that
Mhm.
we want to be part of this report so it can be addressed next time. Now, we also know there's budgets, okay? So if you don't include it in the budget, it ain't gonna get done. It's as simple as that. So if it's not in this year's budget, then, how much does it cost? Give us a price. Tell us what it is. Because then we might say, okay, out of your 27 million, you said it was $500,000, 500,000, take it out of that. Or in the next budget, to ARB, we need 27.5, okay? But, there's where you get our support to make that happen. But, show us respect. We're talking integrity here, that, we want this to be a good document.
So,
Okay,
more?
so I'll just go through my things first. Okay?
Oh, okay.
We also mentioned that there's landfills and brownfields, which is methane. We identified that as a source, and yet we have no studies, no information as to what are the emissions at these locations. So again, that's a third category gap. But again, we put it on our radar and we address it. Makes us happy because we know it's going to be done. But that's part of our purpose of being in this partnership. We're also familiar with, what are criteria pollutants, what are the toxic pollutants, and so when I'm looking at our documents, well, basically there's 5. I noticed you added lead, and then you added something else, but CO is one of those criteria pollutants. So when we, the public, are looking at criteria pollutants, and there are 5 on the list, and you have only 4 out of that list, we want all 5. So we don't understand why you did not include CO.
CO is included. Yeah, it's not included in the presentation, but in the
Well,
final emission report, yes.
Things are mentioned throughout the document.
Yeah.
Okay, but we want to see somewhere where it says criteria pollutants, these are the 5. Okay.
So
if
there
we're
are 6
talking-
criteria pollutants,
And if we're talking,
oh, we
yeah, but
didn't
where's
include.
CO? There's no CO.
Why we didn't say?
now there might be a good reason for it, but from our perspective, it's one of the 5 we want to see.
So in the reports, we include tables that
Yeah.
includes all the criteria pollutants, and actually, so if you want to be strict, VOCs is not a criteria pollutant, but it's a precursor of a criteria pollutant, the same as
Well, all I'm
for
saying
ammonia.
is that, we're the public, we're learning,
Yeah,
and if
so-
we know there's 5, then we want to see the 5
Yeah. So
up there.
It-
If it was a mistake on the chart, then we don't want a mistake on the chart. We just want it in.
yeah, so in the reports for the community, you'll see.
And then
but
when we're
if you
talking toxic pollutants, you had your selected list of the toxic ones. Well, we have our selected list also. And our concerns are why was not toluene mentioned? Okay, in the data. Why isn't there
Toluene.
hexane, xylene? So we have our chemicals that we want to be see tracked as well. So all we're asking is sit down, review that list, and if we need to add 4 or 5, that's our request. We want to have these other 4 or 5. It's as simple as that because that's what we're monitoring. And I can show you the data on it. They're bigger numbers than some of the other numbers that you have up there. So if we have to say a top 10, let's negotiate. And what is the top 10? San Bernardino might have 3 different in their top 10. So it will vary, but then let's do it because that's what we're looking for. That's what we want to accomplish. If it's in the top 10, let's make it our top 10. If it ends up 12, then it's 12. But let's settle on that so that we're happy and satisfied. It is identified, just like benzene. If I look at benzene at ConocoPhillips Oil Refinery, it's gone up in 15 years. So don't show a chart up there showing all these things when I can whip out a chart right here and show you it's gone up every single year.
So, can I respond now?
Okay, nope, not yet.
One more.
Okay. So like you included ammonia in
Okay.
there. So why'd you include ammonia when I think, toluene and some of these other guys are more dangerous than ammonia, But anyways, you also made a reference to the SCAG transportation plan and things. Well, I sit on the California Freight Advisory Committee. I sit on the SCAG RTP Master Committee and then 2 subcommittees. And I want to clarify a few things. In terms of projects, SCAG accepts all projects unconditionally. Okay, so they're not sorting as to which are good projects, which are bad projects. As long as you answered all the question, it's added to the list of 1,000 approved SCAG projects. And that's not correct. Same thing happens with their data goes to Caltrans. I sat on the committee and I says, okay, let me give you an example. And I asked the question both to SCAG and to Caltrans. Port of LA and Port of Long Beach are tripling in their volume by 2025, 2030. Right now, there's 35 to 40,000 truck trips a day. So they're going to San Bernardino too and everywhere else. And it's going to be over 100,000. And I asked them point blank, can our freeways handle another 60,000 freight trucks? And the answer was no. Okay, so don't rely 100% on SCAG data, Caltrans data, because see, they're not looking at that. We have to look at it because we're the ones being impacted by that. And so that's why I'm sitting on those other committees to make sure that we're sort of like all in sync, because they're not in sync. They approve anything unconditionally. Let's see.
Should
Okay,
I?
that was
Is
the
it?
part,
Is it? It's my turn now.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for your comments and questions. So there are many. So I will try to go through one by one briefly. So for the sake of time, but. So first of all, you mentioning that you have been tracking the major facilities in your community for overextended period. So I do trust your assessment, and then also glad to see our data put into use, good use. But then the reason that you do not see the substantial reduction in those major facilities is partly due to the way those emissions were kind of regulated or monitored. You do know there is a reclaim. So the refineries are part of reclaim, and they have their own cap. So what reclaim does, as you may well aware of, it is a cap and trade program. So what we're saying is the total cap out of reclaim universe has to be this much, but then where it comes from is not really the predetermined. So let's say some facility shutting down in the riverside or reducing emissions, that could be bought by a facility located near the coast, and then they were emitting more or less the same emissions, could be. But then the way we have seen so far was as a universe, reclaimed universe, the emission cap was maintained. But the good news is we had this reclaimed credit shaving, that rule 2005, passed in December 2005, that expected to have NOx emission cutting pretty much a half, 50%, close to 45% by 2022. And on top of it, during 2016 AQMP, we had additional measure we call the CMB05 that calls for 5 tons additional NOx reduction from the reclaimed sources. So the emission reduction that might have been stagnant depending on the specific facility you would monitor on should have accelerated in next 5-6 years. So hopefully next time when you check the find, hopefully you could see that kind of trend. But also another thing is, unfortunately I have to admit, find, it's the facility, the way they report, if you do not use exact facility ID or names, it could be popping up multiple locations and different names and then kind of discontinuity. So it's you would know, but I trust you would know if you haven't done it over 10 years.
Number.
Yes. Yes.
with it. So
But
in some
then, yeah,
cases, refinery
sure.
owners, so there's two
Thank
different
you.
numbers.
Yeah, that's
I have
good.
those two numbers, so we're
Uh-huh.
very accurate. This is
So
your
yeah,
data.
let's continue to monitoring how they behave in next 5 years. So we have rules, and then that is under development. They should be showing emission reductions, quite good emission reductions in the next 5 years. So I hope that. The second, the sources that like, the container yard and then this abandoned oil wells. And then you actually mentioned the Great World Partnership. So we are not, we cannot be expert of everything. We might know some things a little bit better than the community member. And then you are the best, I mean, you as a community resident are the best location to know what's happening over there. So not just the TSI measurement and the collaborating with the monitoring, we of course we talk to, but also just knowing the number of oil wells that are located at certain location or number of oil wells that are abandoned in such location, that would be the great starting point to QA/QC our inventory and improve it. So I really appreciate the world partnership and then look forward to improvement in that arena. And third one, the next one, this criteria pollutant CO, as we clarified, that is included because it is criteria pollutant, and that is CARB's guideline. So the final, the emissions table, and then in the report, you would see it. I promise it is there. The another one, and then CO versus ammonia. Yes, ammonia not exactly toxic. It does not have the cancer risk factors associated with it. However, ammonia is considered as a PM precursor, so EPA is required to include ammonia in all criteria air pollutants emission reporting. That's why we included it. So
Well,
that
that's why it's great
certainly
because
contribute
we
PM
can create
2.5.
categories, like you created the pause category, which is good. That's a great category. I would like to see you then create a greenhouse gas category so you can see which are the precursors that blend in with the
So
other stuff.
GHG is probably requires a little more discussions because to hear this AB 617 primarily targeting on air toxic exposure and then reducing human exposure to air toxic air pollutants. Is GHG air toxics or not? Some people might debate it. And then, but anyway, when we are doing all these kind of lengthy reports, we have to follow some guideline. So one, definitely
Well,
ARB
you have
is
our
the
permission
blueprint.
to include it. And go
Yeah, maybe we
forward
have to talk with ARB folks
ARB.
about it.
identify it.
ARB.
Yeah.
So are GHGs considered toxics?
It's air pollution still.
Air pollution.
No,
yeah.
this is Vernon Hughes with CARB.
Mhm.
Yeah, so in terms of including it or not including it, we did provide some guidelines for what to include in the inventories. But where the community groups want to include it, I think that is a discussion to have. It isn't a key element that we've required.
Mhm.
So I think, as Sammy has indicated, a discussion of whether you can include it, but it may also pose challenges on how to integrate
Yes.
that information at the community scale. So there may be some technical challenges and timing. But
Well, like I said, it's not a today thing. It's not a tomorrow thing. It gets on our radar screen, and then we start dealing with it with 2020 and 2021. But again, it's a community identified thing that, whatever it takes to do it, but it's a request.
Yeah, that's a good perspective to think for the future years. And then another one, the last one I can see is that the truck activities and then transportation planning perspective. So what we can provide is kind of a similar type of approach that Rafael the request. There's a number of facilities in the community. In a similar line, we can take a look, or we can provide the VMT or the traffic activities that SCAC are predicted per small segment of the road, and so even each the community will have many of them. As they call the traffic link level data, and then it provides light duty data, light duty vehicles, medium duty, heavy duty vehicles is separate category. How much of the traffic activity expected at certain location? So again, since as a community member, you are the expert of what's happening in the community. What we can suggest or we would like to do is we disclose the all underlying database and then basically going through QA/QC with you, and then we would love to improve our inventory.
Then you also have, remember, you have authority to ask too. You
Sure.
can,
So,
you
and
can
then it's
speak-
glad that you are on the board of different committees, so you can voice for us as well.
See, because you can speak to the Port of LA and the Port of Long Beach via the CAP program as one venue, that it has been brought to our attention that there is no emission inventories from container storage yards, and we feel Port of LA, Port of Long Beach, that is your responsibility. CEQA requires direct and indirect. This would be part of that
Okay.
indirect, but tell them. You
Okay.
expect them to provide you that inventory so that your inventory is correct. And if they fail to provide that, then you take an action,
Okay.
such as like we've been asking for the indirect source rule, we make it happen. You're
Okay.
talking about doing an MOU, then you include that in the MOU if they refuse to do it. But you have our blessings and authority as partners to say, Port of LA, we want that emissions data. It's under your jurisdiction.
Yeah, thank you for
And
comment,
you can put
Jesse.
that into the plan too, that again, it's an action that we're requesting.
Scott, you to have a question?
Yes, thank you. Scott Fruin from USC. I have a little different perspective. One thing I'm concerned here is if you use changes in the inventory as a metric, you're probably going to run into the problem of the high uncertainty of the inventory. Then, as you mentioned, as you go into the future, it's even more challenging. So, I appreciate this whole process is very time and resource limited, but I think if you also look maybe from the top down at uncertainty, you would probably find, like when uncertainty is ever looked at, that uncertainty is dominated by just a few things. And if you identify those and put resources towards reducing uncertainty, the overall metric of progress in reducing the emissions will be a much more reliable calculation. So while we may be missing things, we may be missing source types or small enough facilities, if your uncertainty is too high, it doesn't matter if a small facility gives you an accurate number, right? So I think in this case, you can look at it, and some of the diesel sources are probably dominating the uncertainty, and they probably deserve more resources in reducing the uncertainty than they're going to get unless you make that a focus of the analysis. And I do again acknowledge that there's so much to do here, but I think that would be a big bang for the buck if you also included kind of that top-down look as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the comment. So again, we expect this type of information would improve quite a bit in the future years to come as our effort for this AB 617 continues. For example, we are going to have the community will have lots of the monitoring in next couple of years, and then those monitoring information would provide more like a ground truth that would identify the uncertainties or improve the reduce it type of thing. So thank you for the comments. Raphael, question? Maybe we also move on to the second part of the presentation, but okay, maybe that's been next one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So, you'd mentioned like the NOx reduction and whatnot, and then overall, for instance, satellite images and whatnot that's come into recent play that we're now able to do, and then the overall reduction. So I know our community, particularly in the Boyle Heights, East LA, and Commerce, we're greatly affected by mobile source emissions, something that AQMD really doesn't track too readily and whatnot, because ARB, of course, is responsible for much of that mobile source emissions. So looking back, when you were saying that companies could be utilizing the cap and trade and whatnot in order to reduce emissions in one area and then increase their production in another. While I understand, that happens, it's still very impacting to the particular communities that are affected and that are currently present in the AB 617. I know, for instance, like for us, there are industries, for instance, like the rail and the commerce and whatnot, and then the addition of the traffic in and out of the community from the port of Los Angeles and the movement of goods. It's greatly impacted, our community in that there's been just additional traffic and whatnot. And some of these reductions, again, could have been because of, like for instance, this NOx emission, the switch from regular diesel to a low sulfur or low, just a change in
Low
fuel
sulfur diesel,
formulations in general. And then, in addition to that, and it's not to say that California hasn't done that. I mean, we're the lead on much of that regulation that goes forward, and then ultimately throughout the nation. And then same with vehicle emissions and fuel economies and whatnot. We continue to push that, and so that helps the overall air emissions and those reductions that AQMD sees. But it doesn't necessarily mean that while emissions have gone down, it hasn't gone down as much as it should have, just because the increase in sheer volume. I mean, we have more cars on the road now than ever before in the past decade. And then we have more truck emissions than ever before in the last decade. And some of the, we've seen positive reduction just solely because of these the fuel reformulation, and then the various emissions standards that have been implemented and whatnot. We just want additional policing and enforcement of those current regulations that we currently have in the books. We're not seeing that, and that was one of the reasons why I was really for just more mobile source emissions testing specifically for that. So, and then the other thing that we need to look at is this notion in closing any type of loopholes that there might be, where companies we've seen will split the company in terms of company names and whatnot, but their operation pretty much still remains the same and increases production. But now they utilize two different companies, two different permitting, two different facility ID numbers. But if you look at the aggregate and the total emissions combined, their output is greatly, a lot more, and is negatively impacting the community that much more. So if we can close, for instance, like a loophole that allows that type of thing to go on, I think that would greatly benefit the community at large. And it'll get companies away from, in the name of, we've sold off the company. Now it's a whole separate division or entity that's operating although within the same grounds, they are operating on a separate permit.
So thanks for the comment. And so enhanced enforcement is a part of AB 617 program. So we do expect more enforcement efforts will be happening in the communities in future years to come. So Joke, anything you'd like to add on that sense?
So I mean, as far as like the permitted unions, I think I know, I understand what you're talking about. So in terms of regulations that apply to a whole facility, like AB 2588 does, right? So it's like the facility is the unit, but on top of that, we also have. Gosh, it's going to sound so bureaucratic, but we have like layers of regulations, right? So basically there are regulations on specific permitted units, right? So whether it's considered one facility with 10 permitted units, each one with permit requirements, right, and permit limits, or two facilities with 5 permits each, right? Those permit limits still hold, right? If that makes sense. So.
Maybe we can have more discussion offline.
Right. I mean, but you're going to start getting into like the actual data and some of the data that you collected, and so that's so we need to keep all this stuff in mind when we're starting to look at that data, and that's what and we've established this as baseline data, and so as we start closing those loopholes, I think, we'll get a better sense of what the community is actually currently facing, even though the ultimately targeting reporting is going to happen in future years. I think it's important to note that and really understand our starting point.
Okay. So I think we have to move on the second part of the presentation. So we discussed the methodology and regulations briefly, and then now delving into the output of the calculation. So this is a South Coast Basin total criteria air pollutants, but here criteria we included only NOx and VOC and PM2.5 because those are more relevant. It doesn't mean these are the only criteria pollutants. So again, these 3 years, 2017, 2024, and 2029. And then red color is NOx emissions, and green is VOC, and the purple is directly emitted PM. So NOx emissions expected to go down substantially in the future years due to all the regulations the South Coast AQMD putting in place, and as well as the California Resources Board for the mobile sources. VOC emissions does not show the same level of reduction. However, the reason behind it is much of the biggest source of the VOC emissions related with the individual population, the humans living in the area, such as consumer products, meaning that your own hairspray, your own painting that you do at home, your own cleaning agent, etc. Those increases with the growth of population. Directly emitted PM2.5, as you can see the numbers, it is kind of stagnant in large, but the reason is also this is directly emitted PM2.5. So in the ambient PM2.5, at least 2/3 of it coming from chemical reactions from its precursor pollutants. The precursor means ammonia, and NOx, SOx, and VOC. So, and then directly emitted PM2.5 is only a small portion of ambient PM2.5. So the emission looks like more or less a stagnant. However, I'd like to note that ambient PM2.5 concentrations goes down, and we hope that our trend continues in the future years. There are lots of concerns about diesel particulate PM, and then because of the connection with the DPM, here we included PM2.5 chart, and then what this shows is top five categories of directly emitted PM2.5 in the basin. So you can count, there are 6, not 5, but the reason there's 6 is top 5 categories change in the future year. So to capture the changes, it happened to be the 6 plotted in this graph. So the different color shows the different years, and then cooking goes up in the future. Again, that is because of the population growth. This is commercial cooking, residential cooking, so everybody that related with the individual human being. Paved road dust is related with the VMT. So as the member commented, the number of the cars we see on the road is the largest ever seen. So together with that comes the miles the vehicle traveled, and then that paved road dust is proportional to the miles, so that's why it goes up slightly. Residential fuel combustion, again, that is population related, is fairly constant. And then light duty passenger vehicle. So there is a standard for the light duty vehicles and the regulations for light duty vehicles by primarily California Resources Board. But the reason we see the constant number here, not really the reduction, is due to tire and brake wear. So when you have light passenger vehicles, we are not talking about just exhaust from the tailpipe, but then the brake wear and the tire, those are proportional to VMT. As cars drives more on the road, then that portion increases. Off-road equipment, NOx PM2.5 emission goes down, and then wood and paper industry, that's economic growth that affected to that specific category. Yes.
So the residential fuel combustion, so that doesn't take into account any type of electric production? Is that yes or no?
Electricity is a separate unit. We have the separate category electricity generating units. Thank you. So, and then these are again South Coast Basin total, but it's tag emission. So again, as we described, mentioned in the previous slides, there are at least 22 different tags we incorporated in this. And then each of the tag has a different risk factors. So to put them on the same page and a consistent comparison, we weighted them with the risk factor, air toxic cancer risk factor. And then also we use, if DPM is 1, for example, hexavalent chromium become 464. Those are the weighting factors used. And then this chart is a bit busy, but what you can see is 2017, that the bar is hitting somewhere 17,000 pound per year mark. And then 2024, it decreases substantially. And then 2029, it's kind of slower phase reduction, you see. And then the categories where the tax coming from, for example, the blue, the deep blue color is off-road equipment, and then dark red is diesel heavy-duty trucks category, and then green is ships and commercial hovercrafts. So as a basin total, you can see the substantial reduction in PM, substantial reduction of tag emission is expected in the heavy-duty diesel truck category. Off-road equipment expected to go through some level of reduction, but the ships and commercial hovercraft category expected a slight increase due to the growth in port activity. And then this one is a different view of the sources that where tax coming from. Here are 10 different sources that contribute to the top 10 sources. And the big, again, those are 3-year changes per category as well. So in 2017, off-road equipment is the largest contributor to the total tag, overall tag in the basin. And the second largest contributor happened to be diesel heavy-duty trucks. But then, due to the regulations on those specific categories in the future years, the tag emissions reduces substantially, and then they are no more become the largest contributor in the future year. The ships and commercial hovercraft, again, due to the increased activity in ports, that becomes a substantial source category in the future years. Light-duty trains, it goes down. Light-duty trucks also goes down. Recreational boats, the tag emission expected to go down in the future years. But you can see aircraft source increase in the future slightly. And then chemical industry, that includes like a plastic and plastic-related manufacturing somehow. It is expected to go up slightly. Here we plot the top 5 sources of diesel PM, since the diesel PM is the driving species of the overall cancer risk in the basin that identified in the previous MATES study. So this unit, again, this is the risk-weighted factor, but then diesel heavy-duty truck is the biggest contributor of diesel PM in 2017. Next to it is off-road equipment, and then the third category is ships and commercial hovercrafts, and then the fourth is a train. And then we use the same scale, and then you can see the size of the bar changes dramatically. And then again, because of the increased activity in the port, the ships and the commercial hovercraft becomes significant source of DPM in the future years. And the features you can see in 2029. From here on, we basically repeated the same type of graphs for 3 different communities. So I will go through this very quickly since it is kind of repeated information. However, if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your question, or even after today's meeting, please provide us your feedback or concerns so we can reflect them correctly. So this is the Boyle Heights, East LA, and West Commerce community. Fairly similar trend that you have seen as basin-wide total. And the NOx emissions reduced substantially. VOC, it's reduced a bit, but it's kind of stagnant. And PM 2.5 kind of increases that because of due to the increase of population. And then top 5 sources of PM 2.5, so it's very similar to the basin total cases, but however, you do not see the ships and the commercial hovercraft. So obviously, East LA do not have those categories in it. So the cooking and paved roads and residential fuel combustion that's driven by population growth are primarily the driving factors of the PM 2.5 emission. And then wood and paper mills, as mentioned in the same chart in the previous one. And then again, light-duty passenger vehicle, this is driven by tire and brake wear, not the exhaust emission. And then this is accumulated the toxic the emissions of the community. The good news is still we expect a good amount of reduction expected in the next 5 years until 2024, and then it slows down slightly. And then the major reduction coming from the diesel heavy-duty trucks and off-road equipment category. These are top 10 sources of tax, but the overlapping components as basin-wide is again the diesel heavy-duty off-road equipment. Train and rail yards are a significant source of emission in the community. So now you can see train becomes one of the significant sources here. And then the typical mobile sources, and then fuel combustion. Top 5 DPM sources, except the OGV and ships and the commercial hovercraft category, it is basically the same categories responsible for diesel PM. So 2017, diesel heavy-duty truck, off-road categories are the highest contributors, but then in the future years, due to the cleaner diesel trucks, that becomes the third highest, but then on the relative sense, the trains going through relatively, not as rigorous emission reductions as the other categories. So train stands out in the future years. These are Wilmington and Carson and West Long Beach. And then here, NOx emission goes down a little bit, but not as big as the basin total due to the existence of large stationary sources here. And then VOC emissions are more or less stagnant. It's a slight marginal reduction, you can see. And then top 5 sources of PM 2.5, and then petroleum refinery definitely show the presence here, and fuel combustion is another one, and ocean-going vessel, yes, definitely they are the significant source of PM 2.5 as well. Tech is a different color now, you can see. This dark blue is now ships and commercial hovercraft, and that category increase in the future. But still good news is off-road equipment and then diesel heavy-duty diesel trucks reduces in the future years. And then top 10 categories, again, the first one is the ships, and then the next one, off-road diesel equipment that include commercial cargo handling equipments, and then also there are presence of lawn and garden equipments here as well, and the heavy-duty trucks, and everything else relatively much smaller scale. And DPM sources, as we expected, is ships and then CHC, commercial hovercrafts, and off-road equipment. And then in the future years, you can see the trains become a little bit more pronounced, but then still the biggest emission is coming from, the largest portion of emission coming from the ships and commercial hovercraft. San Bernardino and Muscogee, the criteria air point trends is fairly similar to the basin total and the other two communities. And then top 5 sources, now the paved road dust becomes the biggest contributor due to the lack of distinctive source of emissions in the community other than relatively many small sources in the community. And then tech emission, it goes down from 2017 to all the way 2029. And then the major contribution of this reduction coming from the heavy-duty diesel trucks and off-road equipment. And the green color is a train section. So train goes down some level of reduction, but still it is one of the major sources in the future years. Top 10 category becomes diesel heavy-duty off-road equipment and trains. And then again, all of them going through substantial emission reductions. And then top 5 DPM sources are very similar, but the train stands out in this community due to the rail yard, the existence of rail yard and maintenance yards. But again, the on-road and then on-road heavy-duty and off-road equipment goes through rigorous emission reduction, a lot more rigorous emission reduction than train sector. So these are, we go through very briefly, but I think the community members and then also tech members are encouraged to take it and then take a closer look. And then if you have any questions and comments, please let us know. We would like to work with you to incorporate that. But then we do acknowledge the limitations, uncertainties. This is, being as a more honest scientist, we have to acknowledge this part. So the emissions never account for, so the first part is emission does not account for transport between communities from one source to the receptor. This is strictly the emissions within the community. So the future years, the source attribution analysis will have more improved information. Because in between that, we will have the project called MATES 5 that we will be doing the very extensive modeling approaches. We will include the extensive modeling approaches there, and then also community monitoring supposed to assist to identify the sources more effectively as well. And then when we are developing this emissions inventory, it is basically top-down approach, and it is based on the numerical grid. It is grid here is mostly 4 kilometer by 4 kilometer grid. So there is inherent uncertainty associated with that. And then also the locations and the exact amount of emissions, especially for area and off-road sources, because we have to use some sort of the surrogate, some sort of the indicator to allocate or assign these emissions at a specific location. So this uncertainty exists even within a community or within basin, so even outside the community as well. And also there is uncertainties in so-called speciation profile. That is basically the point sources, facilities, they report their emissions. However, we have to estimate this toxic emissions from, let's say, mobile sources or area sources, off-road sources, which do not have reported emission. Then we have to use some sort of a speciation profile to estimate their emissions from known and more better known emissions such as NOx and VOC. So that part also brings some level of uncertainties. But having said that, I'd like to bring this chart back. So again, we had this long history of working on emissions inventory and modeling. So even the recent example starting from MATES 4, that is based on 2012-2013 measurement and inventory and modeling. Afterwards, we had the 2016 AQMD inventory and modeling. And then this AB617 base year, we developed a new inventory for 2017. And then currently MATES 5 work is ongoing. That should be the opportunity to take another look at the inventory and the modeling approach. And then upcoming AQMP is 2022. We are kickstarting this AQMP effort. Public consultation meeting is actually tomorrow, and then AQMP advisory group meeting will start this fall. And then during AQMP, we have a major milestone year, that's 2023, that targeting 43 additional reduction of NOx emissions from business as usual case. That's a huge amount of reduction that we expect, we hope we get. And then 2024 and 2029 is AB670's milestone years that coming afterwards, so we will have more chances to refine and improve the inventory and our understanding of source attribution. So with that, the summary is, so on-road and off-road mobile sources dominate air pollutant, air toxic, contaminant emissions in all year one communities. And DPM is a dominant tag in all the 3 communities. But still, good news is on-road diesel PM expected to decline significantly due to ongoing regulatory impact. So this is summarizing today's presentation. So I see lots of questions already coming. Maybe we can start with Janet, if it's okay. Yeah, Janet.
Thank you, and you know, I agree with Jesse. Thank you for all the hard work in terms of putting all of this data together, and I know a lot more is coming, and I look forward to that. So, with that in mind, some thoughts. It would be helpful to be able to compare the community data with regional averages or the regional data, and to make that a little bit easier. And I think one of the big things that I think will be improved over time is moving from showing emissions that begin in it, you know, within the community itself, which is what we have right now, and showing actual concentrations within the community. And then being able to say how much of that concentration is caused by sources within the community versus transport from regional sources coming into that community. Because when we start then to look at the air quality measurements, having it's going to make a lot more sense, because we're going to know that the inventory is going to be just a portion of what the measurements are showing because of the transport issue. And I think it's also important to be able to show that progress is being made to reduce disparities, which is why having an ability to compare the community to a different community or the community to the region is going to be really important. We want to see reductions across the board, but we also want to see reductions in disparities between communities. And I think to that end too, I appreciate all the charts, and I flipped through the reports as well. It would be nice to have the data in tables.
Sure, yes.
And, you know, preferably an Excel file, because for those of us who are data nerds and want to kind of get into the numbers a little bit more, that's going to facilitate that a little bit quicker, and we don't have to manually input everything.
Okay. Thank you for the question. So, a comparison as a regional average, yes, we will provide that information, or at least we'll provide the link how to compare that with the regional average, because regional average emissions are all already published through AQMD, but so we'll provide that. Also, the emission data in the table format, yes, definitely we have that in hand. We had the minor change to make, so we made it in a PDF format, but then we can also provide an Excel format as well. And then third one, the concentration that's coming contributed by the sources outside the community, et cetera. That's actually the one that we need to pursue in the upcoming improvement. So that's not included in the year one community source attribution analysis due to the limitations of this, you know, the tight deadline and then et cetera, all of those. But definitely those need to be included in the future analysis.
Yeah, and so one more detailed question, and then maybe a more broader comment. I was curious why the basin-wide data is being calculated tons per year, and then the community data is tons per day, and so just kind of the background of that. But stepping back, I think it's going to be really important for all of us to figure out how to speed up this process and provide this level of data to the future year communities at an earlier stage in the process. And I know this first year has been a lot of experimentation, a tremendous amount of hard work, and we've had these really aggressive accelerated schedules to get everything done. But I think that there's been a lot of discussion at the community level, a lot of questions at the community level, and here we are, it's, you know, July, and we're just now starting to get into the level of actually understanding the community inventories. So if there's any way we can look at that process and those timelines moving forward, I think it's going to really help benefit the community level discussions, and so you guys don't have to keep asking the same questions every meeting. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for the comments. We will consider that. And then also the unit-wise, we are data nerd in a sense, so we use all kind of different units. But the one thing, the tons per year versus tons per day is basin-wide, there are a lot more emissions. So you can do the emissions coming every day sense. But the community is a subset of entire basin, so we didn't want to, but the intention was to avoid the too many decimal points and then losing the precision by using this, avoid the floating point error in a sense. So the tons per year, meaning you accumulate the entire emissions throughout the year. So even if you have a much smaller emission, then by accumulating entire year, you can still present more whole numbers rather than kind of fraction of an integer. That was a part of the reason. But then in the final, the data table, we use the consistent units.
So yeah, maybe it's just I'm waiting for the table.
Okay, yes,
Okay.
thank you. Okay. And we have one question from the Ken Davison, EPA. So his question is, it might be informative to create a similar set of tech trend slides without DPM emissions to get a better sense of trends from non-DPM sources. So the answer is yes, we can provide that. And the next, Jesse.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. I now have a concern. Realize that we need to have this emissions baselines, because without a baseline, we don't know if things are improving. But now that I've seen the bar chart for criteria pollutants for Wilmington, Carson, Long Beach, and now that I've seen the bar chart for the tax for Wilmington, Carson, we have a major problem. And the reason we have a major problem is because you're showing from 2017 to 2019. Well, what it's telling me, looking at this chart, is great, because it's telling me that for the next 10 years, every rule and regulation that AQMD has in existence being proposed is inadequate. I see no significant reductions at all.
We have luxury of having the port representative here. But
No, but I'm just saying, this is what it's showing me. There's no significant reductions in tax or in criteria pollutants for the next 10 years, which is okay, because see, in the AB 617 committee process, we're also having to deal with, reducing that, okay? And what I see is no significant reductions. All these bar charts are high in all categories, which means now that, thank you, I need this.
But then, thank you for the comments. So the ports expected to grow. That's the growth projection that they made actually 3 years ago when we are developing 2016 AQMP. And then, but since then, there are the efforts, actually very active efforts to improve or reduce emissions from port activities ongoing between us and then ports and then everybody involved in it, so that it was not just us and port. Actually, one of the initiatives that the agency is doing is a primer. It's called so it's Pacific Rim Initiative Marine Emission Reduction Partnership. So what it does is, we are not just looking at here, we are working with all the countries of which container ships are arriving to the ports and trying to come up with the mechanism to accommodate cleaner ships coming here. So that is one of the way to kind of mitigate the emissions from the port growth. And on top of it, there is also the working group that we have to reduce emissions from port as well. So have this chart with a little caveat in mind that this does not reflect the activities ongoing in this year or last year. And then when we are updating this one in, let's say, next year, I'm sure we will see some different things.
Well,
But
like I
then
said,
on
there's
top
not-
of
there's
it,
nothing
would
wrong
you
with
like
representing,
to add something?
Yeah, I would just say that we recognize that the port is a large contributor to emissions in these communities. We have done a lot with our Cleaner Action Plan, and our initial Cleaner Action Plan shows substantial reductions. However, we recognize that the plan was starting to get a little stale. And so we went back and updated it in 2017. Our strategies are very aggressive, and we are going to be doing everything we can to implement those strategies. We are trying to move towards near zero and zero emission technologies in both the off-road equipment as well as the on-road trucks. And to your point, we are looking at strategies to reduce emissions from the ships going forward. So we're going to continue to be aggressive and do the best we can. You made a comment earlier that the port's throughput is going to go up 3 times by 2025. While that would be very good for business, and I'm sure our executive director would appreciate that, would like that. It's our projections are about 4% per year of container growth, and we don't always even meet that. So while we will be growing, I don't think we'll be growing that fast over the next few years, as fast as you indicated.
Like I said, my point, there's nothing wrong with this report. It's great because I realize when I report back to my community and we're looking for reductions that, you know, this is the baseline. We need to reduce it somehow, some way. You know, if we need to work with industry, with new technology grants to support a transition, we're more than happy to do that. You know, the purpose of cap and trade funds and Proposition 1B funds and others is to work with industry to accomplish our goals. So there's nothing wrong with what you've done. I'm complimenting for what you've done because now that is a good baseline so that I know 5 years from now, 10 years from now, did it get better?
Sure.
I need to know that. You know.
I think you used the magic word. The partnership is the magic word. We all working together. We recognize problem. We work together to get a better future.
So I do want to mention, you know, one thing, I guess, in terms of, you know, obviously the rulemaking. So this only reflects adopted rules, already
Correct,
adopted
yeah,
rules
adopted
as of
rules.
a certain cutoff date, right? So it doesn't account for any rules that are currently in development, obviously, because we don't know what those numbers would be, right? And so any rules that we're currently working on or that are on the rule calendar that will be coming up in the next year or two, obviously that's not reflected in any of this. You know, I think from a toxics rule standpoint, you know, I've only been here 3.5 years. I haven't been here that long, but you know, from everything I've heard, you know, toxics is certainly a big focus, has been a big focus in the last couple of years, and in particular, the kinds of toxics rules that has been a major focus has been twofold. One has been the fugitive metal emissions, right? So this includes 1469 would be one example that I would say primarily addresses fugitive emissions. A lot of concerns around other fugitive emissions, lead, arsenic, other types of metals. And so, you know, that is as far as fugitive metals goes. Unfortunately, that is something that is typically not captured in an emissions inventory. But through our work with our monitoring team and our work with our rule team, you know, these are things that we are working to address in those rules to help reduce community exposure through reducing those fugitive emissions. So, you know, unfortunately, there just isn't a way to scientifically represent that in the emissions inventory, but I think there is, you know, pretty widespread recognition that those rules are reducing community exposures. So, you know, I think. You know, I think that when we started this discussion, I think, you know, the recognition that an emissions inventory is a great tool and it's great data, but it's one tool, right? And I think it's like, you know, if we could do everything through an emissions inventory, wow, you know, there's a lot of things that we didn't have to do. But, you know, we recognize that there are limitations. And so that's why we use multiple tools like the monitoring and, you know, and then other types of, you know, other emission controls, right? You know, beyond like stack type controls that help reduce community exposure.
And then remember, the community also has another yardstick. My yardstick is my family. And in my family, in the last 7 years, 5 have gotten cancer. 5 have had to go through chemotherapy. You know, 5 have had to have a surgery. My third brother right now is diagnosed stage 4. And you know what that means. That's my yardstick for me. And it's also a yardstick for many other members out there in the public. So, you know, I'm here not just for my family because but I know what it is to go through all this stuff. But I know what other families are going through as well. And so in the end, AB 617 says improve public health. And that's one of the missions of our nonprofit organizations, is to support that goal and whatever it takes. It's not an easy task. We understand that, but working as a team, working as partners, we can achieve that. There may not be a technology today. It might be just an emerging experiment, but we will support the investment. I don't care if there's 10 different proposals to do the same thing, but different ways. Spend my money, my public money, to do it. And whoever rises to the top, number 1, number 2, number 3, that's fine. It's a good investment.
If I may jump in on this, I think this goes to my first comment of all of the activities that are underway now that are significant. And just because you can't quantify them does not mean that you can't just list them. And it's something also for the communities to understand and maybe want to engage in those different proceedings. And they're not just here at the AQMD, they're all across the board, EPA, ARB, at the ports. And it helps set the stage for the conversation so people don't walk away saying, oh, is this all we're getting? You can put it very simply, and it is responsible not to include something speculative in the emissions inventories and the projections, but it should be noted that these things are underway, and it should be part of the discussion. And on that, going to where there's great value in terms of the source apportionment and the inventories, it does indicate where there's opportunities and where there is risk and exposures. And that kind of goes to, there's been a lot of discussion about this rule or this plan, and what Jesse's saying right now is so super important too. Beyond that, there's a lot of incentive dollars on the table. And if you can pinpoint what are the drivers of risk and exposures in a community, then you're able to better target those incentive funds and say, look, here's the problem. Yeah, bring all bidders to the table who can help us go beyond those regulations, who can help us experiment, and to really use these communities as where we're directing all of these investments. I think we get really caught up in talking about 617 with just, can we add more, another layer of your regulations, which is great because, don't stop doing that. But there's this huge opportunity to go well beyond that and to bring investments, both public and private, into these communities and really put them at the forefront of emission reductions and new technologies. And that really deserves to be part of the conversation, but that does depend on the great work you guys are doing here. So it's kind of like, this is wonderful, do more, go faster.
Okay, thank you for the comment. I think we are approaching the end of the scheduled time, but if there is no more comment or questions, I think,
I
sorry,
have one more quick question. This came up and I didn't quite follow it, but I think the difference you mentioned between a threefold increase in the ship activity versus a 4% growth rate, that's a huge difference. Did I hear that right?
We are using the official projection through ARB, but then ARB worked with the port to come up with the projection. Vernon, would you like to clarify
Where did the
anything?
I was talking about container throughput. So there's a certain amount of containers that go through the port each year, and the growth rate of those containers over the next few years is estimated at about 4% per year. Whether or not it reaches those in the last couple of years, it hasn't. Even though we've had good years, it's still, to get that 4% takes a lot of containers. So I was just responding to a comment that was made earlier about the throughput going up 3 times or 300%, and that's not the case.
Well,
At least
I'm going
not
based
that
on
we see.
the Moffitt study, and that's what the Moffitt study says. Okay.
Okay. One more thing to add to what Janet said about, and Jesse also, about the real driver here, although we're not measuring it, is health. And when it comes to where the resources go towards mitigation, we have seen before that things like reducing on-road diesel emissions is much more effective at reducing exposure than off-road, for example, by several fold. So when it gets to that point, if you can take into account where people are living too close to freeways and that kind of aspect, that's where the emission inventory doesn't help you very much because it ignores those near source exposures. So that's maybe something to keep in mind over the long term is some reduction measures will be much more effective for public health, even though the emission inventory change is the same.
Correct. Thank you.
Yeah.
Vernon, would you like
So
to?
I just wanted to have a quick response there, and then we'll get to Vernon. So, I would certainly note that, for all three community plans, which are still in draft form, certainly on-road emissions came up as a really high priority for the community. So I think there's good recognition of that. Having said that, I think, we're just thinking a little bit more broadly in terms of cumulative burdens, and so. It's reasonable to expect that there are multiple priorities and multiple arms of actions within these plans, right? And so while on-road is definitely one of them that's reflected in all three plans, off-road sources are also actually considered also within the priority and also, has actions to reduce those emissions within the plan. So it's not, thankfully, we're not in the position of just saying one or the other. We can actually do both. So.
Okay, Vernon? No. Yeah, just Vernon, you could come here.
Right. Just got to get closer, I guess. Yeah, just wanted to confirm on the port projections that our inventory staff do work directly with the port in this region, so they are consistent with what the port projects.
Perfect, thank you. So we have one question from online. It's from Christine Manji at CRC. And then the question is the recent AB 617 mobile and flyover data available to review? Were there any preliminary findings? So this one, the Andrea Polidori, our monitoring manager, can answer.
Yes, so monitoring began in all three communities late in June. And in terms of the flyovers, there has been 3 consecutive days of aerial measurements conducted by one of our vendors that is called Aerospace Corporation, and they conducted measurements on July 10, 11, and 12. And so currently, that information, that data is being processed, and is not going to be available, until I think early in August, maybe mid-August is more realistic. It's a massive amount of information, and it takes a very long time to process and to come up with results. Just to give you an idea, I mean, they've basically conducted survey at all 3 communities on multiple days. So it's a massive amount of information that is being processed, but the data will be available soon. In terms of mobile monitoring, we also conducted mobile monitoring in all 3 communities. We started in Wilmington, Carson with our van for measuring VOCs and alkanes and other fugitive emissions from refineries and other similar sources. We have conducted mobile measurements in San Bernardino around the Omnitrans, and we have also conducted mobile measurements in East LA. Again, one of the things with mobile monitoring is that the amount of information collected is massive, and in order to come up with summary maps that the public can easily understand and interpret is going to take some time. But we are working on it, and the best way to find out about updates for monitoring is to take a look at our new website. And so if you look online on our AQMD webpage, on our AB 617 webpage, you will find a link to the air monitoring website.
So any questions from the public? I think then this is it for today. So again, the reports are posted online, and then the emissions table will post before the end of today. And then we do like to receive your comments and then questions, feedback, and then hopefully maybe in 2-week period, would it be?
So
Good.
2 weeks would be August 1st.
By August 1st. So, but again, keep in mind, this is not end of the emissions inventory development or source apportionment. We will be continue working on to improve it. And thank you everybody for attending today's meeting, and we will see next meeting.